You were a mistake that cost us our reputation, and now you are a line item we are buying back for $250,000. Sign the check, bring the boy, and play your part, or you will stay dead to this family forever." My father, Richard Myers, did not look at me when he said those words. His eyes were fixed instead on the shimmering face of his 18-karat gold Rolex Submariner, literally timing my compliance as if I were a mid-tier contractor failing to meet a construction deadline. "My name is Grace Myers. I am 36 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of a high-end interior design firm in Seattle that handles contracts for tech billionaires and boutique hotels." But to the man sitting across from me in the sterile, soundproofed lounge of the Rainier Club, I was still just the stain on his tailored navy suit that he had been trying to scrub out for 2 decades. 20 years ago, my parents threw me out of their $5 million estate in Medina into a freezing November storm with exactly $300 in my pocket and a positive pregnancy test in my hand. Now, they needed me to save their perfect image for a 50th anniversary gala that the Seattle Times was already calling the social event of the season. Before I show you how I burned that gala to the ground and walked away with more than just my dignity, I want to know where you are watching this from and what the exact time is on your clock. But let me take you back to that moment in the club, the air thick with the smell of expensive scotch and the suffocating weight of history. The leather chair beneath me was a vintage Chesterfield, the kind of piece I would usually appreciate for its craftsmanship, but today it felt like a cage. My father pushed a cashier's check across the mahogany table. It was crisp, printed with the logo of a private bank, and the amount was staggering to most, yet to him, it was just the price of a mid-sized renovation. $250,000. That was the value he placed on 20 years of silence, on the hunger I felt when I was 21 and working 3 jobs, and on the son he had never once acknowledged as his own flesh and blood. My son Leo is 19 now. He is a sophomore at the University of Washington, studying architecture, and he has the same quiet intensity that I used to have before life forced me to grow a spine made of reinforced steel. My father did not ask about Leo's grades or his health. He did not ask how we survived the years when we lived in a studio apartment in Renton, where the heater hummed like a dying animal and the windows leaked every time the Pacific Northwest rain hammered against the glass. No, Richard Myers only cared that Leo looked enough like a Myers to pass the eye test at the gala. He needed a grandson to stand on that stage at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel so the board of directors at Myers Holdings would see a legacy of stability instead of the fractured, hollow reality of our family tree. The room was silent, save for the muffled sound of a distant piano playing something by Debussy and the rhythmic ticking of my father's watch. I looked at the check, then at his face. He hadn't aged well. The cruelty had etched deep lines around his mouth, and his hair was a stark, artificial silver. He was wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first car, a rusted-out 2002 Subaru Forester that I used to haul design samples and groceries. I remembered the night he kicked me out. The rain had been turning to sleet, and the wind was whipping through the Douglas firs that lined our driveway. My mother, Eleanor, had stood in the foyer, clutching a crystal glass of Chardonnay, her eyes focused on a smudge on the wallpaper rather than the sight of her teenage daughter dragging a duffel bag into the dark. She hadn't said a word then, and she hadn't called me once in the 7,300 days that followed. Now, they were desperate. My father's company was facing a PR nightmare after a series of leaked emails showed he had been lobbying against low-income housing initiatives in the very city where he built luxury high-rises. He needed a redemption arc. He needed the world to see his beautiful, successful daughter and his promising grandson by his side. He thought he could buy my presence for the price of a small condo. I reached out and touched the check, the paper feeling unnervingly cold against my fingertips. My mind raced back to the early days, the smell of cheap formula and the constant crushing exhaustion of being a solo parent with no safety net. I remembered the day I sat in a public library, using their free internet to research how to start an LLC because I couldn't afford a laptop of my own. I remembered the first client who trusted me to design a single nursery, and how I spent 48 hours straight hand-sewing the curtains because I couldn't afford a professional workroom. Richard tapped his finger on the table, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Well, Grace," he asked, his voice like gravel, "do you want the money or do you want to continue living in that little office of yours?" He didn't even know I had moved my headquarters to a 15,000-square-foot warehouse in South Park last year. He didn't know I had 32 employees and a revenue stream that would make his CFO sweat. To him, I was still the girl in the wet hoodie, crying on the porch. I looked at him and felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had fueled me for 20 years didn't vanish, but it solidified into something sharp and precise, like a diamond-tipped blade. I leaned forward, the scent of his expensive cologne, a mix of sandalwood and arrogance, hitting me like a physical blow. I told him that the price had gone up. I told him that $250,000 wouldn't even cover the interest on the emotional debt he owed my son. I watched the vein in his temple throb, a familiar sign of his rising temper. He started to speak, to remind me of where I came from, but I cut him off. I told him that I would attend the gala. I told him that Leo would be there, dressed in a tuxedo that I would personally select from a designer he couldn't even pronounce. But I also told him that the check stayed on the table. I didn't want his money. I wanted his stage. He didn't understand. He thought he had won. He leaned back, a smug, tight-lipped smile appearing on his face, and he finally looked at me, though it wasn't with love or pride. It was the look of a man who had successfully negotiated a difficult merger. "Fine," he said, pocketing his Rolex. "The gala is on the 24th. Don't be late and make sure the boy gets a haircut." He stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and walked out of the lounge without a second glance. I stayed in that Chesterfield chair for a long time after he left. I watched the late afternoon light fade over the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle glowing in the distance. The city was waking up, the lights of the traffic on I-5 beginning to flicker like a slow-moving river of gold. I picked up the check he had left behind. I didn't plan on cashing it. I had other plans for that piece of paper. I thought about the 50th anniversary gala at the Fairmont Olympic. I could already see it, the grand ballroom filled with the scent of 5,000 white lilies, the glimmer of Waterford crystal under the massive chandeliers, and the elite of Seattle sipping Veuve Clicquot while pretending to care about the Myers family legacy. They wanted a show. They wanted a story of a family reunited, a tale of forgiveness and upper-class grace. I was going to give them a story, but it wasn't going to be the one they expected. My father didn't realize that when you spend 20 years building something out of nothing, you learn how to spot the structural weaknesses in everything else. I knew exactly where the cracks were in the Myers Holdings empire. I knew which accounts were being shuffled to hide the losses from the failed development in Bellevue, and I knew exactly which board members were tired of my father's outdated, autocratic style. This wasn't just about a birthday or an anniversary. This was about the end of an era. As I walked out of the Rainier Club and signaled for the valet to bring around my 2024 slate gray Porsche Taycan, the cold Seattle air felt different. It didn't feel like the wind that had pushed me out of my home 2 decades ago. It felt like the breath of a storm that I was finally bringing home. I drove toward my office. The silent electric engine hummed as I navigated the rain-slicked streets of downtown. I called Leo. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and full of the life that my parents had tried to extinguish before he was even born. I told him we were going to a party. I told him he needed a tuxedo. He laughed and asked if there would be good food, and I told him it would be the most expensive meal he would ever eat, though I doubted anyone would have much of an appetite by the time I was finished speaking. The weight of the check in my purse felt like a weapon. Every detail of the upcoming night was already forming in my mind. The exact moment I would step onto the podium, the specific words I would use to describe the $300 and the freezing rain, and the look on my mother's face when the truth finally caught up with her. My father had spent his whole life worried about his reputation. about the thin veneer of respectability that gold watches and expensive memberships provided. He thought he was buying my compliance for $250,000. He didn't realize that Grace Myers wasn't for sale and that the mistake he made 20 years ago was thinking I was the weak one. In reality, I was the only part of the Myers legacy that had any real steel in it, and on the night of the 50-year gala, I was going to show the world exactly what happens when you try to buy back the life you threw away. The city lights blurred past me, a neon smear of purple and blue as I planned the final design of my father's ruin. It would be my masterpiece, a room decorated not with silk and stone, but with the cold, hard reality of everything they had tried to bury. Family is not just blood, and it is certainly not a line item on a ledger. It is the people who stay when the storm hits, and as the rain began to pour over Seattle, I knew that I was the only one left standing. Growing up in the West Hills of Portland, life was not lived so much as it was meticulously curated. A high-stakes performance where every blade of grass on our 2-acre estate was trimmed to precisely 2.5 inches, and every smile was measured for its social utility. My father, Richard Myers, was the founding partner of Myers & Associates, a boutique law firm that cleared a staggering $1.4 million in annual net profit by representing the kind of people who viewed litigation as a sport rather than a legal necessity. My mother, Diane, was the architect of our social standing, a woman who considered it a personal failure if she spent less than $4,500 a month on various charity luncheons at the Multnomah Athletic Club or silent auctions, where the prizes were always more about the prestige of the donor than the value of the item. In our world, money was the oxygen we breathed, but it was an oxygen reserved only for those who followed the script. My older siblings, Nathan and Carolyn, were the undisputed stars of the Myers production, the golden children who never stepped out of line and never scuffed their expensive leather shoes. Nathan was the pride of the family, a high-achieving dentist who cleared $300,000 a year at his practice in Lake Oswego and drove a pristine white BMW M5 that he washed every Saturday morning with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Carolyn was the perfect faculty wife, married to a dean at Reed College and living in a restored Victorian home that looked like the cover of Architectural Digest, her life a seamless transition from one prestigious social circle to the next. I was the surprise, the late-life addition to the family who always felt like an afterthought, the child who wore Carolyn's hand-me-down sweaters that were always a little too itchy and played with the toys Nathan had already broken. While they were being groomed for greatness, I was the one left in the shadows of our cavernous house, a 4-story Tudor-style mansion with leaded glass windows that cost more to insure than most people made in a decade. But the true nature of my family's love was revealed the moment I stepped outside the narrow lines they had drawn for me. When I sat at the mahogany dining table at 16 years old and whispered that I was pregnant, they did not see a scared, trembling child who needed a mother's embrace or a father's guidance. They did not see the terror in my eyes or the way my hands were shaking so violently that I had to hide them beneath the heavy silk tablecloth. Instead, they looked at me and saw a stain, a biological error that threatened to ruin the 20-year reputation of perfection they had built in the exclusive enclaves of Portland's elite. The silence that followed my confession was colder than the November sleet hitting the glass outside, a silence that felt like a physical weight pressing the air out of my lungs. My father didn't yell, which would have been more human. Instead, he stood up, straightened his silk tie, and walked to his home office to retrieve a legal folder. The cruelty was clinical and efficient, a surgical removal of a daughter who no longer fit the brand. They gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my life into a single scuffed Samsonite suitcase that had been rotting in the attic since the late 80s. My mother didn't help me pack. She stood in the doorway of my bedroom, her face a mask of practiced indifference, clutching a glass of Chablis as if it were a shield against the reality of my existence. My father met me in the foyer, the scent of expensive cigars and old money clinging to his wool coat. He handed me $300 in cash, 3 crisp $100 bills that looked mocking in his manicured hand, and a thick stack of papers clipped together with a silver fastener. It was document 4402-B, a formal disinheritance and non-disclosure agreement drafted by his own firm, a document that stripped me of every single cent of their $3.8 million estate and legally barred me from ever claiming any association with the Myers family name. He told me that as far as the world was concerned, I was dead, and if I ever breathed a word of the truth to the press or their social circle, he would use his legal empire to bury me so deep I would never see the light of day. They drove me to the Greyhound station in the middle of a torrential downpour, the wipers of my father's black Mercedes-Benz S-Class clicking with a rhythmic, indifferent finality, and they watched from the tinted windows as I stood on the curb with my one suitcase, a 16-year-old girl with nothing but a growing life inside her and a heart that had just been hollowed out. I spent the next decade in the brutal, unglamorous trenches of survival, a far cry from the manicured lawns of the West Hills. I moved to Seattle and found a 450-square-foot studio apartment located directly above a 24-hour commercial laundromat in a part of the city where the streetlights were usually broken and the sirens never stopped. The air in my apartment was a permanent, thick haze of industrial bleach and scorched polyester, a smell that seeped into my skin, my clothes, and the very few belongings I owned. I spent my days scrubbing floors, scouring the grime off the baseboards of office buildings in the downtown core until my fingernails were cracked and my back felt like it was being held together by rusted wire. I worked 12-hour shifts as a janitor, a waitress, and a delivery driver, often coming home at 3 a.m. with feet so swollen I had to soak them in cold water just to be able to sleep for 4 hours before the baby woke up. My son Leo grew up in that tiny room, his first steps taken on linoleum that was peeling at the edges, and his first meals eaten on a plastic card table I'd found next to a dumpster. I would sit in the dark while he slept, listening to the hum of the industrial dryers downstairs, and think about the life my parents were leading just 3 hours south. While I was calculating whether I could afford a gallon of milk and a bus pass in the same week, my parents were busy rewriting history. I found out through a stray social media post from a distant cousin that they had told everyone in Portland I was studying abroad at a prestigious boarding school in La Rosie, Switzerland, and had later transitioned into an exclusive European design apprenticeship. They turned my forced exile into a badge of cultural sophistication, using my absence to further polish their own image while I was literally on my hands and knees in a bathroom stall at a bus terminal, scrubbing away the messes of strangers for minimum wage. The psychological toll of that lie was almost worse than the physical labor. To the world, I was a privileged socialite living a dream life among the Alps. In reality, I was a ghost haunting the edges of a city that didn't know I existed, living in a space that smelled of chemicals and desperation. Every time I saw a black SUV that looked like my father's, my heart would stop, and every time I saw a woman who shared my mother's cold, elegant profile, I would turn my head in shame. The financial gap between us wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was a chasm of human experience that they couldn't begin to fathom. They lived in a world where a $400 dinner was a casual Tuesday, while I lived in a world where 40 cents was the difference between a meal and hunger. I remember one specific night during a particularly brutal winter when the heater in my studio finally gave out. The landlord, a man who smelled of stale cigarettes and didn't believe in maintenance, told me it would be a week before he could fix it. I wrapped Leo in every blanket I owned, including my own threadbare coat, and stayed awake all night watching his breath turn to mist in the freezing air, praying that he wouldn't get sick because I couldn't afford a doctor's visit and a missed shift. That night, I held that Samsonite suitcase close and remembered the $3.8 million that was supposed to be my safety net. I realized then that my parents hadn't just taken my money. They had attempted to take my humanity, treating me as a line item that had been successfully deleted from their balance sheet. But they underestimated the girl they threw away. They thought that by stripping me of my inheritance and my name, they would break me. But all they did was burn away the soft, useless parts of the person I used to be. In the silence of that bleach-scented apartment, I began to study. I used the local library's computers to learn everything I could about design, about business, about the very world my father dominated. I started small, taking discarded furniture from the street and refinishing it in the cramped hallway of my building, selling the pieces for a $50 profit that I would immediately reinvest. I grew a skin as tough as the leather on that old suitcase. I learned how to negotiate with vendors who tried to overcharge me and how to command a room even when I was the poorest person in it. I built my empire, Myers Interior Design, not with a small loan from a wealthy father, but with the grit of a woman who had nothing left to lose. By the time I was 30, I was no longer the girl in the November storm. I was a force to be reckoned with, a CEO whose name began to appear in the very magazines my mother used to leave on her coffee table. And through it all, I kept document 4402-B in a locked drawer in my office, a constant reminder of the price of their perfection and the cold, hard reality of the family I was about to dismantle. They thought they had bought my disappearance for $300 and a legal threat, but they were about to learn that some stains don't wash out, no matter how much bleach you use, and some mistakes come back with a price tag that even a Myers can't afford to pay. The black 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class pulled into the circular driveway of my $2.1 million modern minimalist home in Madison Park, with a quiet, predatory hiss of high-end tires against crushed basalt gravel. I stood behind the floor-to-ceiling triple-paned glass of my second-story home office, clutching a lukewarm cup of artisanal espresso that suddenly tasted like copper and ash as I watched the two people who had discarded me 20 years ago step out into the crisp Seattle afternoon. My father, Richard, emerged first, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal wool coat with the same clinical precision he used when signing away my existence 2 decades prior, while my mother, Diane, stepped out of the passenger side, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed in a style that probably cost $400 at a salon in the Pearl District. They didn't look up at the architectural marvel I had built with my own sweat and sleepless nights. They didn't admire the curated landscaping or the custom steel accents that had earned my firm a 6-page spread in Architectural Digest last month. Instead, they walked toward my front door with the entitlement of landlords checking on a delinquent tenant. When the doorbell chimed, a custom-programmed, soft electronic tone that usually brought me peace, it felt like a physical strike against my ribs, and as I walked down the floating oak staircase to meet them, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest that contradicted the icy professional mask I had spent years perfecting. Opening the door, I was met not with a tearful embrace or a stuttered apology, but with the sharp, artificial scent of Chanel No. 5 and the cold, appraising stare of a woman who had spent 20 years pretending I was a ghost. My mother didn't say my name, she didn't ask how I was, and she certainly didn't look at the faint scar on my jaw from the time I had to work a double shift at a warehouse with a fever because I couldn't afford to lose my job. Instead, she pushed past me into the foyer, her eyes immediately scanning the room for something or someone else, while my father followed her, his presence heavy and suffocating like a storm front moving in over the sound. They stood in my living room, surrounded by furniture I had designed and art I had commissioned, and they didn't see me at all. They saw a resource. My mother finally spoke, her voice a polished, melodic weapon, as she informed me that she had read the feature in Pacific Northwest Living about my meteoric rise as a CEO, but it was clear she had only skimmed the technical details of my success to feed her own delusions. In her desperation to fill the hole where her daughter used to be, she had hallucinated a male heir to the Myers legacy, a phantom grandson she had already integrated into the fabric of her social lies back in Portland. The audacity of her betrayal unfolded in a stream of high society anecdotes as she explained, without a hint of shame, that she had already bragged to over 200 members of the Grace Fellowship Church and the board of the Oregon Symphony about her brilliant young entrepreneur grandson, who was apparently the secret pride of the family. She had spent the last 6 months painting a picture of a flourishing young man, a genius who had inherited the Myers intellect, And now that the 50th anniversary gala was approaching at the Fairmont Olympic, the lie had become too large for her to manage alone. They weren't here to reconcile with the daughter they had left to rot in a bleach-scented studio apartment. They were here to negotiate a contract for a performance. My father stepped forward, his hand reaching into the inner pocket of his coat to produce a leather checkbook, and he laid out the terms of my re-entry into their world with the same coldness he used for a corporate merger. They were offering me a $250,000 appearance fee to bring this non-existent son to their gala, to stand on a stage under a $300,000 chandelier and play the part of the happy, reunited family for the benefit of their dwindling reputation. I stood there, my hands curled into fists at my sides, listening to them discuss the price of a human soul as if they were haggling over the commission on a real estate deal. The irony was a jagged blade in my throat because the brilliant young entrepreneur they were so eager to claim, the one who had built a multi-million-dollar design empire from the $300 they had thrown at me in a November storm, was standing right in front of them, but they couldn't see me through the fog of their own misogyny and elitism. They wanted a boy, a male successor to carry the Myers name into the next generation of Portland power brokers, and they were so blinded by that desire that they hadn't even realized my son, Leo, was a 19-year-old architecture student who wanted nothing to do with their world of hollow prestige. But then the conversation took a darker, more predatory turn as my father leaned in, his voice dropping to that low, threatening register that used to make me tremble as a teenager. He told me that if I didn't comply, if I didn't produce this grandson for the gala and help them maintain the fiction they had sold to their church and their colleagues, they would hire a private investigator to track him down and tell him the truth about his mother's disgrace. They threatened to poison my son's mind, to hunt down a 19-year-old boy and weaponize the trauma of my past against him just to ensure they didn't lose face at a dinner party. They were willing to pay $250,000 to maintain a lie, a staggering sum that could have saved me 1,000 times over when I was 19 and choosing between heat and diapers. Yet they offered it now only as a bribe for my silence and my cooperation. They stood in my home, a home they had no part in building, and attempted to extort me using the very child they had tried to abort through abandonment and neglect 20 years ago. My mother began describing the tuxedo she wanted the boy to wear, mentioning a specific tailor on Savile Row she had already contacted, her voice fluttering with the excitement of a director casting a lead role in a play. She talked about the seating chart, about how they would position him next to the governor's daughter, and about the speech my father had already drafted for the grand unveiling of the Myers heir. Every word was a testament to how little they knew me, how little they cared about the actual human beings involved, and how deeply they were invested in a reality that didn't exist. The sheer scale of the financial gap they were trying to bridge with that check was insulting. They thought $250,000 was an irresistible lure, failing to realize that my firm's quarterly tax bill alone was more than that. I looked at the check sitting on my reclaimed teak coffee table, a piece of paper that represented the total cost of their conscience, and I felt a wave of cold, crystalline clarity wash over me. They didn't know that the grandson they had promised to their congregation was actually the daughter they had tried to erase, the same daughter who was now powerful enough to buy and sell the very law firm my father spent his life protecting. They were so busy protecting the status quo of the West Hills that they hadn't noticed the world had moved on, and that the girl they had cast out into the rain had returned as a storm they weren't prepared to weather. I didn't scream, I didn't kick them out, and I didn't cry. Instead, I looked my father in the eye and felt a strange sense of predatory satisfaction. I realized then that they had handed me the greatest gift possible, an invitation to their inner sanctum, a seat at the head table, and a microphone in front of every person whose opinion they valued more than my life. My mother continued to chatter about the floral arrangements and the guest list, mentioning names of Portland families who had looked down their noses at me since I was a child, while my father watched me with a smug, expectant look, waiting for me to bow to his financial superiority. They truly believed they could buy back the 20 years of silence and the cold nights above the laundromat for the price of a mid-sized luxury SUV. They never for a second considered that I might have a plan of my own, or that the grandson they were so desperate to exploit was actually the person who would help me dismantle their legacy brick by brick. I picked up the check, feeling the weight of their desperation in the heavy bond paper, and I told them that I would be there, and that the boy would be there too, dressed exactly as they imagined. I watched the relief wash over my mother's face, a hollow, superficial emotion that didn't even reach her eyes, as she reached out to pat my hand with a gloved finger as if I were a well-behaved pet. They left shortly after, the Mercedes purring back down the driveway and out of my life for a few more weeks, leaving behind the scent of expensive tobacco and the lingering chill of a threat. As I stood in the silence of my home, watching the red taillights fade into the Seattle dusk, I called Leo into the room. He walked in, tall and steady, possessing a quiet dignity that neither of my parents could ever hope to understand, and I showed him the check and told him about the gala at the Fairmont. I told him about the lie they were telling and the bribe they were offering to keep the truth buried under 5,000 white lilies. We stood there together in the twilight, the shadows of the West Hills stretching across the years to touch us here in Seattle, and I explained that we weren't going to that gala to be their props. We were going there to be the truth. My father thought he was buying my compliance for $250,000, but he was actually funding his own public execution. The grandson they promised was a fiction, but the daughter I had become was a reality they were about to face in front of everyone they had ever lied to. I looked at the check one last time before locking it in my desk drawer next to document 4402-B, the legal paper that had once stripped me of my name. The stage was set, the price was paid, and the Myers family was about to learn that when you throw someone away and try to buy them back 20 years later, you shouldn't be surprised when they show up with the bill for everything you broke. That night, after the silent vibration of my parents' Mercedes-Benz S-Class had finally faded into the distance of the Madison Park streets, I found myself sitting alone in my kitchen, a space that usually offered me the sanctuary of clean lines and high-end marble, but now felt like a sterile observation deck for the wreckage of my past. I poured a glass of a 2021 Argentinian Malbec that cost precisely $14 at the local boutique market, a modest choice that felt like a grounding wire compared to the $1,000 vintages my father favored, and I set it down on the kitchen island next to the original 2004 disinheritance papers. Those papers, known as document 4402-B, had yellowed slightly at the edges over the last 2 decades, the ink of my father's signature still looking as sharp and uncompromising as the day he used it to amputate me from the family tree. I stared at the legal jargon, the cold clauses that stripped me of my name and my future, and I realized with a sudden, crystalline clarity that my parents didn't want a daughter, and they certainly didn't want a flesh-and-blood grandchild. They wanted a prop, a human accessory to be draped in silk and positioned in the background of their curated life to mask the rot at the center of their legacy. I reached for my laptop and pulled up a digital file that I had guarded for 20 years, a piece of evidence that I had never shared with anyone, not even Leo. It was a grainy, low-resolution clip of security footage from my old neighbor in the West Hills, Mrs. Torres, who had been the only person to show me a shred of kindness the night I was exiled. The timestamp on the bottom right corner read 9:17 p.m., November 14, 2004, and as the pixels flickered to life, I saw the 16-year-old version of myself standing on the sidewalk, clutching that single Samsonite suitcase while the freezing Oregon rain turned my thin hoodie into a heavy, sodden weight. The footage captured the exact moment the massive copper porch lights of the Myers estate flickered and then died, plunged into a deliberate darkness that signaled the finality of their rejection, while I stood there sobbing, my shoulders shaking with a terror that no child should ever have to know. Watching it now, 20 years later from the safety of my $2.1 million home, I expected to feel the familiar hot rush of anger or the hollow ache of grief. But instead, I felt something entirely different. I felt surgical. The realization that love had never actually been on the table was not a burden, but a liberation, because it meant I no longer had to play the game of emotions, a game they had rigged against me from the moment of my conception. If they wanted to deal in the currency of facts, evidence, and public record, then I would meet them on that battlefield and I would outspend them with the truth. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady and cool, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, the number for my brother Nathan, the golden boy dentist who had spent his life basking in the reflected glow of our father's approval. When he answered, his voice was thick with the complacency of a man who had never had to scrub a floor or worry about a heating bill, but I didn't give him time for pleasantries or the condescending pity he usually reserved for me. I began to ask questions, sharp and pointed questions about the anniversary gala and the stories being told in the West Hills social circles, and under the pressure of my calm, relentless interrogation, Nathan began to crumble. He confessed everything with a desperate, stuttering honesty that revealed just how deep the deception went. He confirmed that the imaginary grandson narrative wasn't just a white lie told to a few friends, but was the literal centerpiece of the upcoming 50th anniversary gala at the Fairmont Olympic. My mother had crafted an elaborate biography for this phantom heir, telling anyone who would listen that he was a prodigy, a young man who was being groomed to take over the family interests, and that his grand unveiling at the gala was meant to be the crowning achievement of the Myers bloodline. Nathan admitted that our parents were terrified of the upcoming board meeting for Myers Holdings and that they believed showing off a male heir would stabilize their influence and quiet the whispers of their waning power. He sounded exhausted, trapped between the loyalty he owed our father and the dawning realization that the house of cards was about to fall, and for a fleeting second, I almost felt sorry for him, a man who had been bought so completely that he didn't even know who he was without our father's permission. But that moment of pity passed as quickly as a shadow, replaced by the cold necessity of my plan, and I told Nathan in a voice that brooked no argument that he was to remain silent about our conversation. I told him, "Don't tell them I'm coming," and I could hear his sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the sound of a man realizing that the storm he had helped create was finally making landfall. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him with the weight of that secret, and I turned my attention back to the kitchen island, where the 2004 papers sat next to the $14 glass of Malbec. I thought about the $250,000 check sitting in my desk drawer, the bribe they thought would secure my silence, and I began to map out the technical details of the evening, treating the gala not as a family reunion, but as a high-stakes design project where the objective was the total demolition of a faulty structure. I began to compile a digital dossier, a collection of documents that told the real story of the last 20 years. The eviction notice from my first studio apartment above the laundromat, the medical bills from the night I had to take Leo to the emergency room in a taxi because I couldn't afford an ambulance, and the tax returns that showed exactly how I had built my empire without a single cent of Myers' money. I even scanned the handwritten note my mother had tucked into the Samsonite suitcase, a cold 3-sentence dismissal that told me not to contact them until I had fixed my mistake. These weren't just memories, they were projectiles, and I was going to ensure that each one hit its mark with the precision of a master architect. I looked at the security footage one last time, watching that 16-year-old girl disappear into the dark of the 2004 rain, and I whispered a promise to her that the darkness was finally over. The kitchen clock ticked toward midnight, the quiet hum of my high-end appliances the only sound in the room, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since before that positive pregnancy test changed the trajectory of my life. My parents had spent 50 years building a monument to themselves, a monument made of lies, expensive watches, and document 4402-B, and they had invited me back into their world thinking I was a broken tool they could repurpose for one last show. They had no idea that I was the one who held the blueprints to their destruction, and that the grandson they were so eager to introduce was merely the shadow cast by the woman I had become in the silence they forced upon me. As I finished the last of the wine, the taste was no longer bitter, but bold and resilient, much like the path I had carved out of the bleach-scented air of my youth. The stage was set at the Fairmont Olympic. The 5,000 white lilies were being ordered, and the elite of Portland and Seattle were preparing their finest attire for an evening of celebrated legacy. But the only legacy being honored that night would be the one I built with my own 2 hands. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark and reflecting my own face back at me, no longer a victim of the West Hills but the architect of its end, and I knew that when the morning came, I would be ready to walk into their gala and show them exactly what a $250,000 prop looks like when it finally starts to speak the truth. I spent the next 72 hours submerged in a tactical fever dream within the high-altitude sanctuary of the Columbia Center, specifically inside the corner office of my lead counsel, Marcus Thorne, a man whose legal reputation was as sharp and unforgiving as the crease in his charcoal Tom Ford trousers. The office was a masterclass in intimidating luxury, dominated by a massive 400-pound mahogany desk that had likely seen more multi-billion-dollar settlements than most courtrooms, and the air was perpetually thick with the heavy, sophisticated scent of expensive pipe tobacco and the invisible but palpable weight of $1,200 an hour expertise. Marcus didn't just practice law, he orchestrated outcomes, and as we sat there surrounded by the shimmering lights of the Seattle skyline, we meticulously prepared what we had internally titled the Myers Truth Packet, a digital and physical arsenal designed to dismantle my father's carefully constructed facade with the cold efficiency of a controlled demolition. This wasn't about a daughter's hurt feelings anymore. This was about the quantifiable, documented reality of 2 decades of systemic cruelty, and every piece of paper we added to the file felt like another brick in the wall I was building to trap my parents inside their own lies. The first item in our arsenal was a high-resolution, ultra-crisp scan of the 2004 disinheritance deed, document 4402-B, which Marcus had examined under a magnifying lamp as if searching for a soul that wasn't there. The digital scan was so clear you could see the slight tremor in the ink where my father's hand had pressed down with a final, hateful flourish. We spent 4 hours debating the placement of this document in the sequence, ensuring that when it hit the screens at the Fairmont Olympic, it would be impossible to misinterpret as anything other than the clinical abandonment it truly was. The second piece of evidence was the notarized statement from my old neighbor, Mrs. Torres, a 3-page affidavit she had signed with a steady hand in the presence of a mobile notary I had dispatched to her home in the West Hills. Her words were a devastatingly simple account of the night of November 14, 2004, describing in heartbreaking detail how she had watched from her window as a 16-year-old girl was cast out into a freezing rainstorm while the lights of the multi-million-dollar Myers estate were extinguished one by one. She spoke of the sobbing she could hear from across the street and the way I had huddled under the eaves of her garage for warmth before she finally brought me a blanket, a statement that stood in direct, violent contradiction to the story of Swiss boarding schools and elite European apprenticeships that my mother had been peddling to the Grace Fellowship Church for years. The third and perhaps most damning item was the high-definition copy of the $250,000 hush money check my father had so arrogantly left on my reclaimed teak coffee table just days prior, a physical manifestation of his belief that every human relationship and every inconvenient truth has a price tag that can be negotiated. Marcus had his team run a verification on the bank routing numbers and the source account, confirming it was drawn directly from Richard Myers' personal executive fund, making it an undeniable piece of evidence that he was actively trying to buy my son's identity and my own silence. We analyzed the check like a forensic team, noting the date, the signature, and the memo line which my father had left blank, a classic move of a man who thought he was being clever but had actually just left a wide-open space for me to write the final chapter of his career. As we worked, The white noise of Marcus's high-end air purification system hummed in the background, a stark contrast to the chaotic, bleach-scented memories of my studio apartment above the laundromat, and I felt a predatory sense of calm settle over me as I realized that for the first time in my life, I held all the high-value cards in this family game. But the physical packet was only half of the strategy, because a truth that isn't seen by the right people is just a secret, and I had no intention of letting my father bury this one in a private meeting or a closed-door settlement. I reached out to the technology and media team at the Grace Fellowship Church, the massive, tech-forward congregation where my father was a diamond donor, a title that usually bought him a certain level of deference and unchecked access to the leadership. Using the pretext that I was his devoted daughter, the successful CEO of Myers Interior Design, who had finally returned to the fold, I convinced the unsuspecting 20-something media director that I wanted to orchestrate a surprise for my parents' 50th anniversary gala. I told him I had a commemorative video, a tribute to their 5 decades of love and legacy, and because my father's name was practically etched into the gold leaf of the church's donor wall, they gave me the administrative login credentials for the anniversary livestream without a second thought. They even offered to help me test the upload, oblivious to the fact that the surprise I was planning was not a montage of family vacations and soft-focus wedding photos, but a surgical exposure of the rot beneath the surface of the Myers name. The trap was now fully set, a multi-layered net of digital and physical evidence that was linked directly to the very platform my parents intended to use for their greatest performance. I spent the final hours of that 72-hour window in my own home office, staring at the blinking cursor on the church's livestream portal, realizing that with a single click, I would be broadcasting the truth packet to every one of those 200 members who had been fed a diet of lies about my European education and my brilliant son. I looked at the $250,000 check again, then at the grainy security footage of my 16-year-old self, and I didn't feel a single drop of hesitation. The girl in the rain didn't have a voice, but the woman in the Madison Park mansion had a megaphone and a lead counsel with an appetite for destruction. I thought about my brother Nathan, sitting in his perfect dental office in Lake Oswego, probably sweating through his silk undershirt as he waited for the hammer to fall, knowing that I had instructed him to keep my arrival a secret. He was the only one who knew I was coming, but even he didn't know the scale of the arsenal I had gathered in Marcus Thorne's mahogany-walled fortress. The technical execution was flawless. I uploaded the files into a hidden queue on the church's server, scheduled to trigger the moment my father took the stage at the Fairmont Olympic to deliver his keynote address on family values and legacy. I could almost smell the 5,000 white lilies that my mother had ordered, almost hear the clink of the Waterford crystal and the hushed, respectful murmurs of the Portland and Seattle elite as they waited for the Myers heir to be revealed. They wanted a show, a curated performance of upper-class stability and generational success, and I was going to give them a production that would be talked about in the West Hills for the next 50 years. My father thought he was buying a line item for $250,000, a small price to pay for the preservation of his pride, but he hadn't factored in the compound interest of 20 years of survival and the meticulous, clinical mind of the daughter he had tried to delete. As the sun began to set over the Olympic Mountains, casting a long, blood-red shadow across the water of Lake Washington, I closed the lid of my laptop with a quiet, satisfying click, knowing that the blueprints for the Myers downfall were now irrevocable and that the storm I had been carrying inside me since 2004 was finally ready to break. I spent that final evening not in a state of anxiety, but in a state of preparation, selecting my attire with the same surgical precision I had used for the truth packet, a sharp, structured black suit that didn't scream for attention but commanded it, a visual reminder that I was no longer the girl in the wet hoodie. I checked the time on my own watch, a sleek, understated piece that didn't need to be gold to prove its value, and I felt a cold, exhilarating sense of purpose as the countdown to the gala began. Every sound in my house, from the soft whir of the climate control to the distant chime of a clock, felt like a heartbeat leading toward the moment of impact. The Grace Fellowship Church tech team sent me a final confirmation email, thanking me for being such a supportive daughter and expressing how excited they were for the surprise. And I couldn't help but feel a dark flicker of amusement at how easily the world accepts a polished exterior. My parents had taught me well. They had taught me that appearances are everything, but they had forgotten the most important lesson of all, that when you build a house on a foundation of lies and discarded people, eventually someone is going to come along with the original blueprints and show everyone where the cracks are hiding. The arsenal was ready, the digital fuse was lit, and in less than 24 hours, the name Myers would no longer be a symbol of prestige in the Pacific Northwest, but a cautionary tale about the high cost of trying to buy back the truth. The date was November 15th, 2024, and the grand ballroom of the Heathman Hotel in Portland had been transformed into a cathedral of manufactured prestige, a space where the air was thick with the suffocatingly expensive scent of $200 a plate filet mignon and the cloying floral notes of hundreds of Joe Malone lime basil and mandarin candles. I stood in the heavy shadows of the velvet-curtained entryway, my hand resting on the cool brass handle of the double doors, feeling the literal vibration of the room's choreographed opulence through the soles of my feet. There were 200 guests seated at tables draped in Italian silk linens, the crème de la crème of the West Hills social circuit, all of them sipping vintage Krug champagne and whispering about the legendary Myers reconciliation they had been promised. My parents were positioned at the center of the elevated stage, framed by an architectural floral installation of 5,000 white lilies that must have cost more than my first 2 years of rent in that bleach-scented studio above the laundromat. My mother, Diane, looked radiant in a custom champagne-colored gown that caught the light of the baccarat chandeliers with every calculated breath she took, her face a masterpiece of surgical enhancement and practiced grace. My father, Richard, stood at the mahogany podium, his 18-karat gold Rolex Submariner gleaming under the spotlights as he adjusted the microphone with the practiced confidence of a man who believed he had successfully purchased the ending to his own story. The live stream was active, a small red light on the professional-grade 4K cameras broadcasting the entire charade to 1,500 members of the Grace Fellowship Church who were watching from their living rooms, waiting to witness the miraculous return of the Myers heir. My father leaned into the microphone, his voice resonating through the high-fidelity sound system with a paternal warmth that I knew was as synthetic as the polyester blend of the hand-me-down sweaters I used to wear. He began his speech, his eyes sweeping the room with a predatory sense of triumph as he spoke about legacy, about the endurance of the family name, and about the deep, private joy of a grandfather finally reunited with the next generation of excellence. He reached the crescendo of his introduction, his voice cracking with a perfectly timed, manufactured emotion as he announced to the room and the digital audience that the greatest gift of their 50-year marriage was the return of their grandson, the brilliant young man who represented the future of the Myers name and the continuation of their storied bloodline. That was the exact moment I chose to move, pushing the heavy doors open with a deliberate, rhythmic force that cut through the expectant silence of the ballroom like a physical blow. I didn't walk in with the bowed head or the humbled, apologetic posture of the disgraced daughter they expected to see. I didn't arrive as the line item they thought they had bought for $250,000. Instead, I moved through the center aisle with the terrifyingly precise stride of a woman who had built an empire out of the rain and the cold, wearing a $3,000 black Alexander McQueen power suit with sharp, structured shoulders that made me look less like a guest and more like an executioner. The fabric of the suit was a wool-silk blend that absorbed the light of the chandeliers, making me a dark, undeniable focal point in a room filled with pastel silk and hollow smiles. Beside me, walking with the same quiet, steel-spined dignity that had seen us through the lean years, was Lily, my 19-year-old daughter, the person my parents had spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist, the living proof of the mistake they had tried to erase with $300 and a legal threat. Lily was the person they had hallucinated into a male heir to satisfy their archaic need for a patriarch. But here she was, a stunning, brilliant young woman who carried the Myers features with a grace they didn't deserve to witness. The silence that fell over the Heathman Hotel was not the respectful quiet of an audience. It was the horrified, vacuum-like silence of a room where the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out. I could see my mother's hand tighten around her crystal flute of champagne until her knuckles turned a ghostly white, her carefully curated mask of perfection beginning to crack at the edges as she realized that the grandson she had bragged about to her church was nowhere to be found. My father froze at the podium, his mouth still open to finish the sentence about the Myers name, his eyes darting from me to Lily as if trying to calculate the cost of this deviation from the script in real time. He looked at the 4K cameras, then back at us, the realization dawning on him that the 1,500 people watching the live stream weren't seeing a male heir. They were seeing the daughter he had disinherited and the granddaughter he had never once acknowledged. Lily didn't look at the guests or the flowers or the expensive centerpieces. She kept her eyes fixed on the man on the stage who had timed her mother's compliance with a gold watch, her expression one of calm, clinical observation. We reached the front of the room, stopping just beneath the edge of the stage where the scent of the lilies was almost nauseatingly thick, a funeral smell disguised as a celebration. I didn't say a word at first, allowing the weight of our presence to settle over the 200 guests who were now looking back and forth between the stage and the aisle in a state of mounting confusion. I could see my brother Nathan at table number 1, his face a pale shade of gray, his eyes fixed on his plate as he waited for the explosion he knew was coming because he was the only one who had known I was actually stepping onto this stage. The light from the projectors caught the sharp lines of my McQueen suit, casting a long, dark shadow that stretched toward my father's feet, a visual representation of the 20 years of darkness they had forced upon me. My father's hand was trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass, the ice clinking against the crystal with a frantic, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous room. He tried to speak, to perhaps pivot the narrative or usher us away before the damage became irreparable, but the microphone was still live, and the Grace Fellowship Church audience was still watching. And for the first time in his life, Richard Myers had lost control of the room. The contrast was absolute. On the stage were the architects of a lie, draped in the trappings of a wealth they had used as a weapon, and on the floor were the survivors of that lie, dressed in the armor of a success they had earned without a single penny of help. I looked up at my mother, whose eyes were now darting toward the exits, looking for a way to escape the public record of her own cruelty, and I felt a surge of that surgical calm I had cultivated in Marcus Thorne's office. I thought about the truth packet sitting in the digital queue of the church's server, ready to be unleashed the moment I signaled my lead counsel, and I realized that this moment was the final design of my life's most important project. Lily squeezed my hand, a brief, grounding gesture of solidarity, and I could see the reflection of the stage lights in her eyes that had never seen the inside of a Swiss boarding school, but had seen the hard work of a mother who refused to let her daughter be a line item. Every detail of the room felt hyper-vivid. The way the condensation was dripping down the silver ice buckets, the sound of a guest's fork hitting the floor in the back of the room, the faint, high-pitched whine of the professional lighting rigs. My father finally managed to find his voice, though it was thin and lacked the gravelly authority it had held only seconds before, as he stuttered out a greeting that was intended to sound welcoming, but came across as a desperate plea for mercy. He called me his dear Grace and gestured toward Lily as if he were trying to retroactively claim her, attempting to weave our unexpected arrival into the fabric of his speech without acknowledging the gender of the grandchild he had promised. But the lie was too brittle. The gap between his words and our reality was too wide, and the audience was already beginning to whisper, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves before a storm breaks. I stepped onto the first stair of the stage, my black heels making a sharp final click against the polished wood, and I saw my father flinch as if I were carrying a physical weapon instead of just the truth. I wasn't the 16-year-old girl in the rain anymore. I wasn't the janitor scrubbing floors above a laundromat. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm, and I was the mother of the woman who was currently destroying the Myers legacy just by standing in the light. My mother reached out a hand, perhaps to touch me or perhaps to push me away, but she stopped midair, her fingers hovering near the sleeve of my suit, intimidated by the sheer quality of the fabric and the coldness of my gaze. They had invited a prop to their gala, thinking they could manipulate the daughter they had discarded, but they had accidentally invited the architect of their ruin. As I reached the podium and stood beside my father, the smell of his sandalwood cologne was drowned out by the metallic tang of his fear, and I knew that the next few minutes would be the most expensive ones of his entire life, far exceeding the $250,000 bribe he had left on my table. The cameras were rolling, the elite were watching, and the daughter they tried to erase was finally about to take the microphone and tell the world exactly what it cost to be a Myers. The grand ballroom of the Heathman Hotel, which only moments ago had been a sanctuary of curated lies and high society whispers, suddenly went lethal. Quiet. A vacuum of sound so absolute that I could hear the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of my father's gold Rolex and the frantic, shallow breathing of my mother as she realized the stage was no longer her own. I did not wait for an invitation to speak, nor did I look for the approval of the 200 elite guests who sat frozen in their upholstered chairs, their silver forks suspended mid-air above their cold filet mignon. I walked directly to the mahogany podium, my black Alexander McQueen suit cutting a sharp obsidian silhouette against the backdrop of 5,000 white lilies, and I reached out to tap the microphone with a single manicured fingernail that sent a sharp metallic crack echoing through the high-fidelity speaker system. "Richard, Diane," I began, my voice steady and cold, resonating with the authority of a woman who had spent 20 years building a life out of the wreckage they left behind. "You told everyone in this room and everyone watching on that church live stream that you were waiting for the triumphant return of a grandson to secure the future of the Myers name." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a physical weight on their shoulders, and then I leaned closer to the microphone, my eyes locking onto my father's pale, sweat-slicked face. "But I think you forgot to show them the actual paperwork that defines this family's legacy," I said, and at that exact, pre-arranged second, the massive projector screens behind them, which were supposed to show a montage of soft-focus family photos and prestigious vacations, flickered to life with a violent digital jerk. It was not a family montage that greeted the audience. It was a high-resolution, terrifyingly clear scan of the 2004 disinheritance deed, document 4402-B, and Marcus Thorne's team had ensured that the most damning clauses were highlighted in a brilliant, bleeding neon red that seemed to pulse against the white ballroom walls. The words, "No moral or legal obligation to the child and stripped of all future claims to the Myers estate," stood out in stark, legalistic cruelty, a direct contradiction to the narrative of a loving, supportive family that my mother had spent the last hour peddling to the congregation. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room, the sound of 200 reputations being re-evaluated in real time, but I was not finished with the demolition of their facade. Before my father could reach for the power cord or my mother could find her voice to scream a denial, the screen transitioned to the grainy, black-and-white security footage from Mrs. Torres's driveway on that Tuesday in November 2004. The 4K projectors made every detail agonizingly visible. The 16-year-old girl in the thin, soaked hoodie, the single Samsonite suitcase sitting in a puddle, and the cold, deliberate moment the porch lights of the Myers mansion were extinguished, leaving a pregnant child to sob alone in the freezing Oregon rain. The footage played in a loop, a silent, flickering testimony to the abandonment that they had tried to bury under layers of expensive perfume and Joe Malone candles. And for the first time in his life, my father looked small, his expensive Brioni suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for his shrunken, defeated frame. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out the $250,000 cashier's check, the paper crisp and mocking in the harsh stage lights, and I stepped toward my mother, who was clutching her champagne flute so tightly I expected the crystal to shatter in her hand. I extended my arm and pressed the check into her trembling fingers, the white paper a stark contrast to her champagne-colored silk gown. "You can keep this, Mother," I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the room where the waitstaff had stopped moving, their trays forgotten as they watched the public execution of a dynasty. "You cannot buy a grandson who does not exist to cover up the daughter you tried to destroy 20 years ago, and you certainly cannot use my child as a prop to fix a reputation that was built on a foundation of bleach and lies." I turned to look at Lily, who stood at the base of the stage with her head held high, the living, breathing evidence of their failure. And I saw the mayor of Portland, who had been sitting at the head table, accidentally drop his wine glass, the red liquid splashing across the white linen like a fresh wound. Beside him, the pastor from Grace Fellowship Church, the man who had been ready to bless the Myers legacy, reached out with a trembling hand and manually turned off his camera, his face a mask of profound shock and moral confusion, as he realized he had been an unwitting accomplice to a 20-year deception. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of ozone and ruined pride, the perfect Myers legacy evaporating in exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds of documented truth. My father tried to step forward, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the weight of the highlighted disinheritance deed behind him seemed to pin him to the spot, a digital ghost that refused to be exorcised. He looked at the guests, the people he had spent his life trying to impress, and saw only a sea of judgment and disgust, their eyes no longer reflecting the gold of his watch, but the cold, hard reality of the 16-year-old girl in the rain. My mother began to weep, but it was not the graceful, silent weeping of a victim. It was the frantic, ugly sobbing of a woman who had lost her most valuable currency, her social standing. I stood there for a final moment, savoring the absolute ruin of the world that had cast me out, and I realized that the $300 they had given me in 2004 had finally been repaid with a compound interest of total public exposure. I didn't need their money, and I certainly didn't need their name, because as I walked off that stage with my daughter by my side, I knew that the only real legacy in the room was the one I had built with my own hands in the silence they forced upon me. The silence followed us as we walked back down the center aisle, past the mayor, past the stunned socialites, and past the abandoned plates of expensive food that no one had the stomach to eat. Behind us, the screens were still glowing with the image of the girl in the rain, a permanent stain on the Heathman Hotel's history that no amount of Joe Malone candles could ever mask. My father's voice finally cracked through the quiet, a desperate, hollow cry for us to wait. But we didn't turn back, our footsteps on the polished floor the only sound in a room that had finally run out of lies. As we reached the double doors, I felt the weight of 20 years lift off my shoulders, replaced by the cool, invigorating air of a Portland night that no longer felt like a threat. We stepped out onto the sidewalk where my car was waiting, the black Porsche Taycan a silent, high-tech contrast to the ancient, rotting traditions of the West Hills. Lily looked at me, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true meaning of family. Not as a line item on a ledger, and not as a performance for a church livestream, but as the quiet, unbreakable bond of the people who survive the storm together. The digital world was already exploding, the live stream recording having been captured by hundreds of church members before the pastor could kill the feed. And I knew that by morning, the name Myers would be a synonym for a cautionary tale in every boardroom and country club in the Pacific Northwest. My father had spent 50 years protecting his reputation, only to have it dismantled by the very daughter he thought he could buy back for $250,000. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw the reflection of the Heathman Hotel in my rearview mirror, the lights of the ballroom flickering as the guests began to flee the scene of the disaster. and I felt a sense of peace that was more valuable than any inheritance. I thought about document 4402-B, the paper that was supposed to end my life, and I realized it had actually been the blueprint for my freedom, the catalyst that forced me to become a woman who didn't need a father's permission to exist. The check was back in their hands, the lies were on the screen, and the truth was finally out in the open, cold and sharp and undeniable. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And as the city lights of Portland blurred past us, I knew that I had finally designed a life that was perfect. Not because of how it looked to the world, but because it was built on the one thing my parents could never understand: the absolute, unwavering truth. By Monday morning, the high-gloss, impenetrable fortress of the Myers reputation had not just cracked. It had suffered a total structural collapse that left my father standing in the middle of a debris field of his own making. The fallout was as swift and clinical as the demolition I had orchestrated at the Heathman Hotel, beginning with a series of urgent, cold-blooded phone calls from 3 of Myers Holdings' most prestigious real estate development clients, firms that managed multi-billion-dollar portfolios and had previously viewed my father as the gold standard of Pacific Northwest reliability. These men and women, who had sat at the gala and watched the projector screens flicker with the evidence of document 4402-B, did not reach out with words of sympathy or requests for explanation. Instead, they issued formal notices of termination for their representation and management contracts, citing a sudden and irreparable reputational risk that made any further association with the Myers name a liability they were unwilling to carry. My father's office in downtown Portland, a space filled with Eames chairs and original oil paintings of the Oregon coastline, became a tomb of silence as his staff realized that the foundation of the firm, the myth of the untouchable moral patriarch, had been vaporized in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The social execution was equally absolute for my mother, Diane, who woke up on Monday to find that the world she had spent 40 years meticulously curating had locked its gates and changed the passcodes. By noon, she had received a formal, albeit polite, request to resign from the board of the Grace Fellowship Church, the very institution where she had once been a diamond donor and a pillar of the community. The leadership, terrified of the viral nature of the live stream footage that was now being shared across every social media platform in the region, decided that her presence was no longer compatible with their mission of family values. A supreme irony that I'm sure was not lost on her as she sat in her silent West Hills kitchen, surrounded by 5,000 white lilies that were already beginning to brown at the edges and smell like rot. I didn't wait to hear their excuses, their frantic justifications, or the inevitable attempts to gaslight me into believing that the 2004 disinheritance was for my own good. Instead, I took my titanium-cased phone and blocked their numbers with a single, steady swipe of my thumb, effectively erasing their ability to reach me ever again. To ensure the finality of our separation, I had Marcus Thorne set up a rigorous legal filter on my professional and personal email servers, a digital perimeter that automatically redirected any communication containing the keywords Myers, Richard, or Diane straight to his high-security firm for review and archival. I was no longer interested in the sound of their voices or the weight of their shadows, and as I drove my 2024 slate gray Porsche Taycan back across the state line toward my quiet, sun-drenched home in the Madison Park neighborhood of Seattle, the air inside the cabin felt lighter, purged of the sandalwood and Chanel No. 5 that had suffocated my childhood. My house greeted me with the honest beauty of natural light hitting wide plank oak floors and custom-milled cabinetry, a space where every design choice was a reflection of my own vision rather than a compromise for someone else's approval. In this house, there are no hidden legal deeds, no imaginary grandsons, and no dark corners where secrets are kept to protect a brand. There is only the truth, laid bare in the minimalist architecture and the shared laughter that echoes through the hallways when Lily comes home from campus. Lily is currently finishing her final year of her architecture degree at the University of Washington. and she is doing so entirely debt-free, a feat made possible only because I spent a decade scrubbing floors, calculating bus fares to the penny, and working the graveyard shifts in bleach-scented warehouses that my parents once said would break me. They predicted I would be a statistic, a cautionary tale of a girl who threw away a $3.8 million inheritance for a mistake. But they failed to realize that Lily was never a mistake. She was the motivation that turned a scared 16-year-old into a CEO. Watching her spread her blueprints across the kitchen island, her brow furrowed with the same quiet intensity I used to design my first boutique hotel, I feel a sense of catharsis that no $250,000 check could ever provide. I am 36 years old, and I have finally repaid the $300 they gave me with the only currency that matters. A life lived on my own terms, free from the toxic gravitational pull of a family that valued their image more than their own flesh and blood. The West Hills estate will likely be sold within the year to cover the legal settlements and the loss of business revenue, and the name Myers will eventually fade from the charity plaques and hospital wings, replaced by names that didn't have to buy their respectability. My brother Nathan called one last time from his Lake Oswego office, his voice trembling as he realized he was the captain of a sinking ship. But I didn't answer. I simply listened to the silence that followed the end of the ringing, a silence that signaled the final closing of a door I should have locked 20 years ago. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you have nothing left to hide, and as I sit on my deck overlooking the shimmering waters of Lake Washington, watching the sun dip behind the Olympic Mountains in a blaze of orange and violet, I realize that the girl in the November storm finally found her way home. The legal documents are now just paper. The gold watches are just machines for measuring a time that no longer belongs to them, and the story of the Myers legacy has finally been written by the one person they tried to silence. Family is not a contract you are forced to sign at birth, and it is not a debt you spend your life paying off in compliance and performance. It is a choice made every single day to show up, to be honest, and to protect the people who would never dream of casting you out into the rain. I have built my own family out of the people who stayed when the bank accounts were empty and the studio apartment smelled like chemicals, and that foundation is stronger than any Tudor-style mansion in Portland. As the evening chill begins to settle over Seattle, I go inside and close the triple-paned glass doors, the seal clicking into place with a sound of absolute security, leaving the ghosts of the West Hills to haunt the ruins of their own perfection. I am Grace Myers. I am a mother. I am a creator. And for the first time in 20 years, I am exactly where I am supposed to be, standing in the light of a truth that cost me everything but gave me back my soul. The gala is over. The screens have gone dark, and the only thing left to do is live the life that was never supposed to happen. A life designed with precision, resilience, and a love that no amount of money could ever hope to replicate. If you have ever had to cut a toxic, supposedly perfect family out of your life just to survive the weight of their expectations, then you know that the first breath of freedom is the sweetest one you will ever take. You know that the silence of a blocked caller ID is more beautiful than any symphony, and that the warmth of a home you built yourself is more comforting than any ancestral estate. My journey from that Greyhound station in 2004 to this kitchen in 2024 was not a straight line, but every jagged turn and every sleepless night was worth the moment I looked my father in the eye and showed him exactly what his $300 had grown into. I am done being a line item, I am done being a prop, and I am done waiting for an apology that would never be enough to cover the interest on 20 years of abandonment. The future of the Myers name doesn't belong to a boardroom or a church board. It belongs to the woman who walked through the rain and the girl who grew up to be the architect of her own destiny. I look at the 2004 disinheritance papers one last time before feeding them into the shredder in my office, watching as the words, "no moral or legal obligation" are turned into harmless confetti that I will toss into the recycling bin on Tuesday morning. There is no more power in those words, no more threat in the signature of Richard Myers, and no more shame in the memories of the bleach-scented studio. The design is complete. The structure is sound, and as I walk down the hall to tell Lily that dinner is ready, I realize that the most beautiful thing I ever created wasn't a room or a building, but the boundary that finally kept the storm outside where it belongs. This is my story, and while it started with a slap and a November storm, it ends with a quiet house, a brilliant daughter, and the realization that the best way to win a game rigged by your parents is to simply walk away from the table and build your own.